Every afternoon, she came home the same way. Not the way 7-year-olds usually come home, bursting through the front door, backpack swinging, already talking about something that happened at lunch before they even get their shoes off. Zoe Webb came home quietly. She came home slowly. She came home like someone who had spent the entire day holding something heavy and hadn't yet figured out how to put it down. Marcus would watch her from the kitchen doorway sometimes. Just watch, the way a father does when he already knows something is wrong but hasn't yet found the words to say it out loud. He would see her step through the front door, set her backpack down with a gentleness that almost looked like exhaustion, and then stand there for a moment. Just a brief moment, like she needed to remember how to be home again. Her face said everything her mouth refused to. She was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. There were shadows under her eyes that had no business being on a 7-year-old. Her shoulders, small and narrow, curved inward just slightly, as if she were trying to take up less space than she already did. And her smile. She still smiled every single time Marcus asked how her day went. That was the part that stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. Not the exhaustion, not the silence, the smile. "I'm okay, Daddy," she would say, soft and even, like a line she'd rehearsed. "Everything's fine." He would nod. She would go to her room, and Marcus would stand in the kitchen with a glass of water he'd forgotten to drink, trying to understand how a little girl who had never once lied to him could look him in the eyes and say she was fine. He knew she wasn't lying, not exactly. Zoe wasn't the kind of child who lied. She was the kind of child who protected. She'd been raised that way. To be thoughtful, to be fair, to think about how her words might land on other people before she let them go. Marcus had taught her that himself. He was proud of it. And now he stood in his kitchen wondering if somewhere along the way, that lesson had turned into something else entirely. Not compassion, avoidance, not kindness, silence. So one morning before the school day began, he did something he had never imagined he would do. He clipped a small device, barely the size of a button, onto the strap of her backpack, tucked behind a seam where no one would think to look. He kissed her forehead, watched the car pull away from the curb, and spent the next 8 hours telling himself he was doing the right thing. That night, he sat down to watch the footage. He didn't move for a very long time after that. Marcus Webb was not the kind of man who walked into a room and announced himself. He didn't need to. At 41, he had the kind of quiet that came from knowing exactly who he was and having nothing left to prove about it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and the composed hands of someone who had learned early that steadiness was its own form of strength. He wore plain clothes. He drove a modest car, not because he couldn't afford otherwise, but because he had long ago decided that the things he owned said very little about the things that actually mattered. What Marcus Webb owned, in practical terms, was a great deal. A private equity firm he had built from a single office and 2 employees into something that employed hundreds across 4 states. Real estate holdings up and down the eastern seaboard. Investments that had compounded quietly over 15 years into a number most people would struggle to say out loud. But none of that was what he led with. And none of it was what he wanted his daughter to lead with either. Zoe was 7. She had her mother's eyes, wide and dark and quick to find the funny thing in any situation, and her father's composure, that particular quality of being fully present in a room without demanding anything from it. She wore her hair natural, 2 puffs on either side, and had a habit of addressing every adult she met with, "Yes, ma'am," or "Yes, sir," before she'd even learned their name. Not because she'd been drilled on manners, but because she actually meant it. That was the thing about Zoe. She actually meant most things. Marcus had raised her alone since she was 3. Her mother Diane had passed from an illness that moved faster than any of them had been prepared for, and in the years that followed, Marcus had done what he knew how to do. He built a structure, held it steady, and made sure his daughter never once felt the ground shift beneath her. He rearranged his schedule around school pickups and bedtime stories. He learned to braid hair through online tutorials at midnight and never once mentioned it to anyone. He had one rule above all others, and he repeated it often enough that Zoe could finish the sentence herself. Money tells you what you can buy. It doesn't tell you who you are. He wanted her to grow up understanding that the woman who cleaned the school hallways and the man who owned the building were equally deserving of a good morning and a thank you. As far as Marcus could tell, she had understood this completely. She was kind to everyone, genuinely, effortlessly kind. Her teacher from first grade had pulled Marcus aside at the end of the year just to tell him that in 20 years of teaching, she had never seen a child Zoe's age navigate a classroom with that level of natural empathy. That was before second grade, before the new classroom, before everything changed. Zoe had been enrolled at Hargrove Academy since kindergarten, a private elementary school with a strong academic reputation, manicured grounds, and the kind of brochure photography that featured a carefully balanced mix of children's faces to signal inclusion without necessarily practicing it. Marcus had chosen it for the curriculum. He had trusted it with his daughter. He was beginning to understand what that trust had cost her. It didn't happen all at once. That was the thing about it. If it had been sudden, if Zoe had come home one day crying or refused to go to school or said something that named what was happening, Marcus would have known what to do. He was good in a crisis. He had always been good in a crisis. But this wasn't a crisis, not at first. It was a series of small things that each, on their own, could be explained away. It started in September, 3 weeks into the new school year. Zoe's second grade class had been reassigned to a different teacher, Mrs. Carol Hensley, a veteran at Hargrove, who had been there longer than most of the administrative staff, and was spoken about in parent circles with a reverence that Marcus had always found slightly suspicious. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. A new teacher was a new teacher. But by October, he was thinking about it constantly. The changes in Zoe were subtle enough that he almost talked himself out of them. She was quieter at dinner, but kids went through quiet phases. She was slower to finish her food, but maybe she'd had a big lunch. She fell asleep on the couch one Thursday evening before 7 o'clock, still in her school uniform, shoes still tied. And when Marcus carried her to bed, she didn't stir once. He told himself she was growing. He told himself kids got tired. Then came the Friday she sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes without touching her homework. Just sat there, pencil in her hand, staring at the page. Marcus pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Zoe," she looked up. "Talk to me. What's going on at school?" The smile arrived right on schedule. Small, practiced, unbothered in all the wrong ways. "Nothing, Daddy. I'm okay." He tried again the following week, and the week after that. Each time, Zoe answered the question he asked, and nothing more. She wasn't evasive the way a child is when they're hiding something they know is wrong. She was careful the way a child is when they've decided, very quietly, that telling the truth would cause more problems than it would solve, not for herself, but for everyone around her. That distinction kept Marcus up at night. He knew his daughter. He knew the difference between a child who didn't trust her parent and a child who trusted her parent so much that she was trying to protect him. Zoe wasn't shutting him out. She was standing in front of a door and gently asking him not to open it, not for her sake, but for everyone else on the other side. He had taught her to think about other people first, and now he watched her carry something she couldn't name, and understood for the first time that a lesson he'd meant as a gift had somehow become the very thing trapping her inside it. He started with the school's official channels, because that was the reasonable thing to do. He sent an email to Hargrove's front office in late October, polite and specific, asking for a meeting to discuss how Zoe was adjusting to her new classroom. The response came 2 days later, friendly, brief, and managed entirely by an administrative assistant who scheduled him for a 15-minute slot the following Thursday. When he arrived, he was met not by Mrs. Hensley but by a vice principal named Gail Tanner, who nodded a great deal, took notes she never looked at again, and told him that second grade was always a transition year and that Zoe seemed to be settling in just fine. Marcus asked if he could speak with Mrs. Hensley directly. Gail Tanner smiled and said she would pass that along. No one followed up. 2 weeks later, he tried again. Same process, different administrator, same outcome. He was being managed, handled with the particular smoothness of an institution that had long ago perfected the art of making concerned parents feel heard without actually listening to a word they said. Marcus Webb did not exhaust easily, but he also understood that pushing harder through official channels without something concrete to point to would get him nowhere. He needed to know what was actually happening inside that classroom, not what the school told him, not what the brochure implied, what was actually happening. He ordered the camera on a Tuesday in early November. It arrived Thursday. It was small enough to sit unnoticed behind the shoulder strap buckle of Zoe's backpack, the kind of device that looked, if anyone looked at all, like an ordinary piece of hardware on an ordinary bag. He spent an hour that night making sure it was positioned well and the battery would last a full school day. He told himself the entire time that he would find nothing. He was wrong. He watched the first day's recording alone in his home office after Zoe had gone to bed. The footage was imperfect. The angle caught parts of the classroom in partial frame. The audio was inconsistent. But it was enough. More than enough. He watched Mrs. Carol Hensley move through her classroom with the authority of someone who had occupied that room for so long she had stopped thinking of it as a space she shared with anyone. He watched her call on students, the same cluster of students rotating predictably, while Zoe's raised hand went unacknowledged for stretches so long that eventually Zoe stopped raising it. He watched lunchtime groupings form with an ease that looked natural until you noticed that the one child who never found a place in them without effort was always the same child. And then he watched a moment that lasted less than a minute. A boy in Zoe's class said something about her hair. Marcus couldn't make out the exact words, and two other kids laughed. Zoe went very still. Derek Nash, the young classroom aide standing 4 feet away, turned his head toward the sound, registered what had happened, and then turned back to the shelf he'd been organizing. Mrs. Hensley was at the whiteboard. She didn't turn around at all. Zoe picked up her pencil and went back to her worksheet. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything. She just went back to work, the way someone does when they've already learned that no one is coming. Marcus closed the laptop. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he opened it again. He watched 5 more days of footage before he said a word to anyone. Each evening followed the same pattern. Zoe in bed by 8:30. Marcus at his desk with the laptop open and a glass of water he never touched. And for the next hour or two, he watched his daughter move through a classroom that had quietly, methodically decided she didn't quite belong in it. The behavior was never loud. That was what made it so difficult to name. Mrs. Hensley didn't raise her voice at Zoe. She didn't single her out for punishment or say anything that could be pulled from context and held up as evidence. What she did was more deliberate than that, and in many ways more damaging. She created a classroom where Zoe's presence was consistently treated as less significant than everyone else's. Assignments returned to every other student first. Praise distributed freely around the room with a logic that somehow never landed on Zoe, even when Zoe's work was correct, even when Zoe's answer was the right one. Small exclusions, stacked one on top of the other day after day, until the weight of them added up to something a 7-year-old couldn't name, but could absolutely feel. Derek Nash appeared in the footage regularly. He was young, mid-20s at most, and Marcus could see in the recordings that something in him wasn't entirely comfortable with what he was watching. There was a moment on the 3rd day during a group activity when Zoe was left without a partner and Nash stood nearby. He looked at her. He looked at Mrs. Hensley. He took a small step forward that never became a full one. Then he moved to the other side of the room and busied himself with something else entirely. He saw it. He made a choice. Marcus returned to Hargrove the following Monday. This time he asked specifically for Mrs. Hensley and made clear he would wait as long as necessary. After 35 minutes in a lobby chair, he was brought to a small conference room where Gail Tanner reappeared alongside a district curriculum coordinator named Paul Sheridan, who had the practiced demeanor of someone whose entire job was to sit in rooms like this one and prevent them from going anywhere useful. Marcus was measured. He laid out what he had observed in Zoe's behavior at home, the exhaustion, the withdrawal, the weight of something she was clearly carrying but wouldn't speak about. He was careful not to mention the camera. He asked pointed questions about classroom management practices and how student participation was distributed. Paul Sheridan nodded sympathetically and said all the right things about Hargrove's commitment to inclusive learning environments. What stayed with Marcus from that meeting wasn't what was said. It was what happened when he used the word fair. He said simply that he wanted to make sure his daughter was being treated fairly in her classroom. A small, reasonable word. And something shifted in the room when he said it. Not dramatically. There was no eye roll, no audible scoff, just a slight recalibration in posture, a micro-adjustment in the quality of attention directed at him, as if the word had confirmed something they'd already assumed about why he was there and what kind of parent he was going to be. They looked at him the way people look at someone they've already decided is overreacting. Marcus recognized it immediately. He had spent his entire professional life in rooms full of people who looked at him that way before he opened his mouth. He had learned over 20 years to let it pass through him without breaking his stride. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was his daughter, and the patience he had once treated as a discipline was beginning to feel, for the first time, like a liability. He went back a third time. No appointment, no intermediary. He arrived at Hargrove on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, 40 minutes before the first bell, and walked directly to the faculty wing. He found Mrs. Carol Hensley in the teacher's lounge, coffee in hand, in conversation with two colleagues. He introduced himself as Zoe Webb's father, and he watched her face arrange itself into the expression she kept ready for moments like this. Warm, slightly puzzled, professionally concerned. "Mr. Webb," she said, "of course. Is everything all right?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," he said. He told her what he had observed in Zoe at home. He told her about the exhaustion, the withdrawal, the way a child who had once talked through dinner now sat through it in near silence. He told her he was not there to accuse anyone of anything. He was there because his daughter was suffering in some way that traced itself back to this building, and he needed someone to take that seriously. Mrs. Hensley listened with her head tilted at just the right angle. When he finished, she said that Zoe was a wonderful student, very sweet, a little on the quiet side. She said that second grade introduced new academic expectations and that some children needed more time to find their footing. Every sentence was correct. None of them were true in the way that mattered. It was the moment just after she finished speaking that told Marcus everything. One of the colleagues still in the room glanced up and caught his eye, not with hostility, but with something quieter, a look that lasted less than a second before she dropped her eyes back to her phone. It was the look of someone who recognized what was happening and had already decided it wasn't her problem to fix. Marcus thanked Mrs. Hensley for her time and drove home. What had happened in that room was not a confrontation. It was something more insidious, the experience of being given the full performance of concern while nothing whatsoever was actually being offered. He had been polite, he had been specific, and what he had received in return was a wall built entirely out of pleasant words. The problem, Marcus now understood, was not one teacher with a bias she'd never examined. The larger problem was the room around her, the colleagues who stayed quiet, the administrators who scheduled meetings to prevent resolution rather than reach it, the institutional instinct, smooth and practiced, to protect its own surface before it protected the children inside it. That was what Zoe had been navigating every single day since September. Zoe found out on a Thursday evening, not about the camera, but that something was in motion. She overheard Marcus on the phone with his attorney, in his office with the door mostly closed, using words that 7-year-olds aren't supposed to understand but often do. Words like documentation and pattern of conduct and formal complaint. She was standing in the hallway when he came out. He knew immediately from her face that she had heard enough. He crouched down to her level and started to explain, gently, that he was handling something at school, that she didn't need to worry. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Daddy, please don't." He looked at her. "Please don't make it a big thing," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely serious. "I don't want people to be mad at each other." "Nobody's going to be mad at you," he said. "I know," she said, "but they might be mad at each other, and that's because of me." He pulled her into a hug and told her he loved her. She hugged him back, small arms tight around his neck. He could feel her turning it over in her mind even then, not thinking about herself, but about the ripples. He had taught her that, to think about the ripples. And now those ripples were the cage she'd built around her own pain. The following week, the school shifted its approach. Marcus received a letter from Hargrove's legal office, not aggressive, carefully worded, noting that the school had reviewed the concerns raised in recent meetings and found no evidence of the conduct described. Attached was a written statement from Mrs. Hensley and a summary from Principal Ronald Briggs, characterizing Zoe as a student who was still developing the social confidence expected at this grade level, and who might benefit from additional support resources. It was precise and deliberate. They were building a counter-narrative, one that described a quiet, withdrawn child with adjustment difficulties, not a child who had been systematically excluded. They were rearranging the story so that by the time anyone looked at it, the shape of it would already favor them. Marcus forwarded the letter to his attorney and went back to the footage. It was a Wednesday in late November when everything shifted. Marcus was in a meeting when his phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, who sometimes helped with afternoon pickup. The message was short. "She doesn't look right. Come home." He was out of the building in 4 minutes. When he walked through the front door, Zoe was sitting on the couch with her backpack still on, both hands folded in her lap, staring at a fixed point on the floor. She wasn't crying. She wasn't visibly injured. She was simply present in the way that a person is present after something has taken too much out of them to leave any remainder. Marcus sat beside her and put his hand over hers. "Hey," he said, "I'm here." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry but emptied in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She opened her mouth, and for a moment, he thought she was finally going to tell him everything. Instead, she said very quietly, "I'm okay, Daddy." And the words came out so automatic, so hollow, that they landed harder than silence would have. He got her to bed early. Then he opened the footage from that day. The recording showed the school's side yard, where physical education was held on days the main field was in use. A group activity had been organized, some kind of relay structure, teams assigned by the supervising teacher. Marcus watched Mrs. Hensley move down a line of students, pointing left or right to divide them into groups. When she reached Zoe, she paused, looked down at her clipboard, and said something Marcus couldn't fully hear. Zoe nodded and stepped to the side. She stood there for the next 19 minutes. Not as a punishment, not with any explanation Marcus could identify. She was simply placed to the side and left there while the activity continued around her. 2 teachers cycled through the yard during that time. A staff member crossed the space with a cart of equipment. Each of them moved through their tasks without stopping. One of them made direct eye contact with Zoe for a moment, long enough that Marcus felt certain something would happen next. Nothing happened next. Zoe stood with her hands at her sides and watched the other children run. She didn't sit down. She didn't call out. She stood there with the absolute quiet of a child who has already learned very thoroughly that asking for more is less safe than asking for nothing at all. 19 minutes. Marcus closed the laptop and did not open it again that night. He sat in his office until past midnight. He thought about the letter from Hargrove's legal office. He thought about Ronald Briggs and his summary of Zoe as a child with social confidence issues. He thought about Derek Nash turning away from a 4-foot distance. He thought about every administrator who had nodded and smiled and scheduled him into smaller and smaller rooms. And he thought about his daughter on that couch with her backpack still on, telling him she was okay in a voice that had already stopped believing it. He had given the school time to do the right thing, more time than they deserved. He opened his email and began to write, not to Hargrove's administration, not to their legal office, but to his own attorney, to a journalist he had known for 11 years and trusted completely, and to the district superintendent's office, marked urgent. He sent all 3 before 1 a.m. The story broke on a Friday morning. Marcus had not gone looking for a spectacle. What he had given to the journalist, A woman named Patricia Okafor, who had spent 15 years covering education policy and institutional accountability, was a documented record.
The camera footage,
Cataloged and time-stamped. A written log of every attempt he had made to contact the school. The letter from Hargrove's legal office, and a single additional document that Patricia had uncovered herself. A formal complaint filed against Carol Hensley 2 years earlier by the family of another black student, which Principal Ronald Briggs had processed internally, resolved with a written note in a personnel file, and never escalated. Patricia published carefully. She laid out the timeline, quoted the documents, described the footage with precision, and let the facts assemble themselves into the shape they had always been. By noon, the piece had been shared thousands of times. By mid-afternoon, the Hargrove Parent Forum had collapsed into something between a reckoning and a chaos. Parents who had never noticed anything wrote that they were shocked. A smaller number wrote that they had noticed things, small things they hadn't been sure how to name, and had said nothing. One parent, whose son had been in Hensley's class 3 years prior, wrote a response 11 paragraphs long that began with the words, "I owe someone an apology." The district superintendent issued a statement by end of business Friday announcing an immediate review of Hargrove's administrative practices and a formal investigation into the conduct described. Carol Hensley was placed on administrative leave. Ronald Briggs followed the next Monday, once the district confirmed that his handling of the prior complaint constituted a failure of mandatory reporting obligations. Derek Nash was not placed on leave. He came forward voluntarily, before Marcus's attorney had contacted him, before the district reached out, and provided a detailed written account of what he had witnessed over the course of the year. His statement filled in the parts that camera footage alone couldn't capture. It didn't undo anything, but it was something. What emerged from all of it was not the story of one bad teacher. It was the story of a system that had learned to protect its own comfort at the expense of a child's. Hensley had operated the way she operated because nothing had ever required her to stop. Briggs had buried the prior complaint because surfacing it would have been disruptive. Nash had looked away because he was 24 and new, and the path of least resistance felt more survivable than the alternative. And the colleagues, the staff members who had passed through that yard while a 7-year-old stood alone, each of them had their own version of the same calculation. Not malice, most of them. Just the ordinary, everyday decision to let someone else's problem stay someone else's problem. What shook people, Marcus knew, was not the wealth angle, though plenty of the coverage reached for it. What shook people was Zoe. The reason she had said nothing, not fear, not confusion. A 7-year-old child had absorbed the belief that her pain was less important than other people's convenience, and she had acted on that belief faithfully for months, alone. That was the part nobody could quite move past. He waited until the noise died down before he sat with her. There were calls to return and statements to review and a meeting with the district investigator scheduled for the following week. But on Saturday morning, 2 days after the story broke, he set his phone face down on the counter, made 2 mugs of hot chocolate, and carried them to the living room where Zoe was sitting on the floor with a book she hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. He set a mug in front of her and lowered himself onto the couch nearby. He didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, present and unhurried, in the way he had learned was the only real invitation a person could offer. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Zoe closed her book. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the mug, both hands wrapped around it, and began to talk in the slow, careful way of someone taking apart something they had built over a long time. She told him about the first week of 2nd grade, how she had raised her hand on the very first day and Mrs. Hensley had looked straight past her like she wasn't there. She said she had thought, at first, that it was an accident, that the next time would be different. She told him about the lunch table, the way the groups formed every single day with an ease that always seemed to leave her one step outside the edge of things. She told him about her hair, about the boy who had said something she didn't want to repeat, and the way the kids around him had laughed, and the way no one had said stop. She told him about standing in the yard. She said it plainly, without drama, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. She said she hadn't understood at first why she'd been told to step aside. She thought maybe she'd done something wrong and just couldn't figure out what. So she stood there and tried to think about what it might have been. And by the time the activity was over, she still didn't know, and no one ever told her. Marcus kept his face steady. It cost him something. Then Zoe looked up at him, and her eyes were wet in the way that comes just before crying when a person has been not crying for a very long time. "I didn't tell you," she said, "because I didn't want you to be sad, and I didn't want anyone to get fired." She stopped, swallowed. "I thought if I just kept being good, kept being really good, maybe it would get better by itself." The first tear came down without any sound. "I thought it was something I was doing wrong," she said. "I kept thinking if I was better, then maybe." Marcus moved from the couch to the floor. He sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and he held her while she cried the way she had clearly needed to cry for months. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something dammed up for a long time finally finding a way through. He let her cry until she was finished. He didn't rush it. When her breathing evened out, he spoke the way he spoke when it was only the two of them and nothing else mattered. "I taught you to be good to people," he said. "And you were. You are. But I left something out, and that's on me." He paused. "Being good to people doesn't mean letting them hurt you and staying quiet so they don't have to deal with what they did. That's not kindness, baby. That's just being alone." Zoe was quiet for a moment. Then she asked in a small voice, "Is it selfish to want someone to help you?" "No," Marcus said. "That's called being brave." She thought about that. Then she nodded slowly, like someone filing something away in a place they intended to keep. The formal investigation concluded 6 weeks later. Carol Hensley did not return to Hargrove Academy. The district's review confirmed a consistent pattern of differential treatment across multiple years, substantiated by Nash's written account and by records that surfaced once investigators began asking questions the administration had previously discouraged. Her contract was not renewed. Ronald Briggs resigned before the district could complete its disciplinary process, submitting a letter that characterized his departure as a personal decision made in the best interest of the school community. His handling of the prior complaint was formally documented in the district's findings and referred to the State Board of Education for further review. Derek Nash kept his position. It was a decision Marcus had not opposed. Nash had been the least powerful person in the room, and he had ultimately come forward when coming forward cost him something. Marcus was not interested in punishment for its own sake. He was interested in whether the people involved understood what they had done, and whether the structure around them would make it harder to do again. Hargrove was required to implement an independent oversight process for all conduct complaints, with mandatory escalation protocols that removed any single administrator's ability to bury a grievance quietly. A third-party equity review of classroom practices was commissioned. The board made the results public, rather than managing them internally, the first genuinely decent thing the institution had done throughout the entire ordeal. Marcus gave Zoe the choice about where to finish the school year. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she told him she wanted to go somewhere new. Not because she was afraid, she explained carefully, but because she wanted to find out what school felt like when it felt okay from the very beginning. They spent a weekend visiting 3 schools together. She chose one. On her first day at the new school, Marcus drove her himself. He watched her walk toward the entrance from the car, backpack on, 2 puffs neat on either side of her head, taking in the building with the focused attention she gave to things she was still deciding how to feel about. At the door, she paused, turned back once, and found him through the windshield. She raised one hand in a small wave. He raised his hand back. She went inside. He sat in the car for a long moment after she disappeared through the door. The morning was quiet around him, ordinary in the specific way that good mornings are, unremarkable from the outside, significant only in context. He thought about the months behind them, about the footage on the laptop, about a little girl standing alone in a side yard for 19 minutes while the world moved around her and nobody stopped. About the same little girl on the living room floor, telling him she had stayed quiet so no one would be sad. He thought about what it had cost her to be that considerate at 7 years old. He had taught her to be good. He understood now that good on its own was incomplete. Good without the right to speak was just endurance with a pleasant face. What he needed to finish teaching her, what she had already remarkably begun to teach herself, was that her voice was not a disruption. It was the point. That afternoon she came home smiling, not the small, practiced smile she'd worn for months. This was something else, looser, unguarded, the kind of smile that doesn't arrive on schedule but shows up on its own because something inside finally has room to. She dropped her backpack by the door, kicked off her shoes without ceremony, and came directly into the kitchen where Marcus was standing. "Daddy," she said, "I raised my hand today and she called on me first." Marcus looked at her. "I knew the answer," Zoe added, as if this were the important part. "I knew it the whole time." He pulled her into a hug and held on a little longer than usual. There are children out there right now who are too considerate for their own good, who have learned, somewhere along the way, that keeping quiet is the kindest thing they can do. And there are parents who love their kids fiercely but haven't yet found the words to tell them, "Your voice matters. You are allowed to take up space. Kindness and self-respect are not opposites." If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about people who refuse to look the other way, subscribe. We'll be here.